Hey there, my friends, it's Glenn with the Cactus Atlas, and today we're going to be exploring various monuments and cemeteries around Tombstone, Arizona. So for this episode, I was thinking there are 3 different locations, all dealing with burials, cemeteries, things like that around Tombstone, Arizona, which really touches on the deep legacy of history that you'll find here in this particular town. So throughout the episode, we're going to be traveling to see historic grave sites and even a cenotaph of somebody that you all are going to know extremely well when we get there to the more modern cemetery. But first, it's only appropriate to start, I think, where it all started, technically. So that there is supposed to represent what miners back in the day would build, albeit not quite that big and grandiose, I think, but whenever they found something of value that they wanted to claim, they wanted to make a claim, they would build stone monuments like that, which is very appropriate for the gentleman buried here on this site. As most viewers already know, probably just from watching Hollywood flicks, Tombstone was a boomtown, a mining town, based on a discovery of silver back in the 1800s, and it became quite the place with very colorful tales and some more true than others. But where did it all start? Well, it started by a gentleman named Ed Schieffelin, who was out here prospecting in this very dangerous country at the time. This was Apache land, and they didn't take kindly to people encroaching on their lands out here. And Mr. Schieffelin was once told that all he's going to find out here is his tombstone. And technically he did. And of course, the first tombstone he helped found was the town of Tombstone, I think inspired by that. And the rest is really history. This was a very important mine out here, made lots of money, made a lot of people rich, made a lot of people dead. And Mr. Schieffelin here started it all. But it's really a nice, I think it's the Arizona State Park System that now owns and takes care of this, but it's a really nice monument. You can actually see it from quite a ways off. It's very prominent once you spot it on the landscape. And it adheres to Mr. Schieffelin's dying wishes, his will. Because after Mr. Schieffelin made his discovery out here, he moved on. Ended up at the end of his life actually in Oregon, where he was living and still prospecting amazingly. And that's where Mr. Schieffelin died. But before we get into the story, let's actually go take a quick look here at the monument. Now, I'm not good with heights, but this thing is pretty dang tall, I have to say. Very big. I think fitting for what Mr. Schieffelin helped start out here. And you can see one of the faces here actually has some words on it. So Ed Schieffelin died May 12th of 1897, 49 years and 8 months old, a dutiful son, a faithful husband, a kind brother, and a true friend. That'd be Ed Schieffelin. What's the story of this guy's end? It's clear, he's really the founder of Tombstone, so that speaks for itself. But yeah, he had ended up moving to Oregon, and when he was there, he was still doing prospecting. In fact, when they found him dead in his cabin, I believe they found him face down on the floor, and they ruled it a heart attack. So pretty common cause of death, about 49-year-old male back then. But apparently they found some ore samples from his prospecting that actually assayed pretty high, they say. There's a couple different accounts of that. Kind of ironic to meet his end that way, and they say nobody knows where he found those samples. So maybe there's a lucrative claim out there yet to be found today. I don't know. Sometimes things get a little bit gray when you're studying history, but yeah, so Mr. Schieffelin did not die here in Tombstone, ironically. You think he would have, but well, he was actually buried in Oregon at first, and then they realized, I guess, or they made note of his will and his dying wishes, which was to be buried in Tombstone. He kind of described the general area that he wanted to be buried, I assume we're in the area he described, right outside of town. And he wanted to be buried as a miner, wearing miner's dress, having a pickaxe, a hat. Really, because at heart, it seems like he was a pretty humble guy. He didn't have interest in being wealthy and rich. And mining for gold and precious metals and silver was really the thing in life that made him happy. So his request was actually to be buried here in this location, dressed as a miner. So obviously that happened. So basically he's interred here. They moved his body from Oregon here and dressed him in the clothes that he requested. And now Mr. Schieffelin, I think, has one of the best views in Tombstone. Because if you look around, this landscape, it's beautiful. I'm actually quite jealous, to be honest, because this would be a great final resting place for people to come and remember you. Just very peaceful on this hilltop. A nice climate. Probably just have to share the space with some rattlesnakes, some scorpions, but if you're good with that, I could see this being prime real estate for your immortal journey after life. Anyway, I reckon a lot of people have no idea this is even here, because when you come to Tombstone, usually you're a few miles in town. It's very touristy. You've got a lot of competition, I guess, for attractions. So if people are short on time, they probably don't really know to come here to pay respects. It is a dirt road, a gravel road, but I'd say it's passable, at least today, by any vehicle. So I've driven up here in a standard two-wheel drive vehicle once before and had no issues at all. So I would say it's very accessible. So if you really are into the historical aspect of things like Tombstone and you want to come pay your respects to the guy that started it all, and it has in a way, a bittersweet ending. He did die a little young. Maybe that was not young for back then, but he did get his wish, and people cared for him enough that they went through the trouble to make this actually happen. And now we have a very amazing piece of Arizona history here to see. Welcome to the Tombstone Cemetery. No, not that cemetery. You're thinking of Boothill, aren't you? We're gonna go check that out, but I wanted to show you that this town has another cemetery. You can see this is much different than those of you that know Boothill, which is all recreated wooden markers that replaced wooden markers that probably deteriorated time and time again. This is more of a typical cemetery you would expect. And check that out, there's a little monument, just like the Schieffelin monument. I wonder if this is just for decoration, if there's actually somebody buried here. You never know. I've come here to seek out two things. The first is an official grave of somebody, I would say a very important figure of Tombstone, and this guy actually, it said, witnessed the shootout at the OK Corral. So that should be a hint to those that know some of the history around this. And then the other thing is technically not a site where a body is buried or there are remains, but there is a memorial to a famous Hollywood actor. I'm gonna just keep saving it, because if you haven't figured it out by now, maybe you haven't seen a lot of the Tombstone movies, or one of the Tombstone movies I'm thinking of, but a lot of you already know. Actually, this looks like there is something historic here. Actually, you've got, I see a bunch of cavalry and infantry soldiers buried here, the Comrades of Burnside Post, GAR. So these would have been military members back in the 1800s. Looks like they all died around like 1887, 1888, 1890. So all around the same time for a lot of them, and some a little bit later. If you look at the dates though, you do have a pretty good mix. You see some like the 1930s is when Mr. McDonald was put to rest here, but then right next to him, John Schneider died in 1894. So it is an old cemetery. This isn't like some super modern cemetery, although it looks a lot more modern now. But if you look around this place, you'll definitely find people that were buried here during the Old West. So you got a bunch of concrete here. It's one of these things is not like the other kind of thing. Back there's a brownish colored stone that we're seeking out, and it says Fly on it. And the name on it is Camillus S. Fly. You probably hear him referred to as C.S. Fly much more often. And he died on October 12th of 1901. I want to say that's 51 years of age. A little hard to read, but I'm pretty sure that's a 51. Now I know some of you probably aren't familiar with the name C.S. Fly, so I'll kind of give you the bigger claims to fame, but I actually admire him in his work and what he did. He was involved with quite a bit. Kind of an important person, I would say, in the town, but let's talk about the more well-known facts here. So C.S. Fly, if you've been to Tombstone and you visited and you have been to the OK Corral, you'll notice a building that kind of abuts the scene where everybody's shooting each other. That was this guy's C.S. Fly's boarding house and photographic studio. So the way I've read it is that he had several rooms that he rented out, and then in the very back of the residence there was his photo studio. His wife was also a photographer, I read, but one of the things, the claims to fame is on that famous shootout, apparently I've read that he witnessed it, and I haven't taken time to see if I could find any documents of provenance to back that up, but it seems very feasible. I mean, we know for sure his studio is right next to the OK Corral, and it's said that during the shootout, that is a building that Ike went into to kind of retreat the scene, as he was saying he wasn't armed. And you kind of see that in the movie Tombstone. The Tombstone with Kurt Russell is the one I'm thinking of, that particular scene. So I would say, I don't know if everything, there's some embellishment, I think, in that scene, of course, but to make a good movie, you kind of got to do that. But basically, it was this guy's building, if you want to think about it in those terms in the movie, Mr. C.S. Fly, in his boarding house and photo studio. And that's another thing, that the stuff that people probably don't know about this guy is that he took a lot of photos, and he's considered an early photojournalist. So for example, in the days of Geronimo, the guy laying here before us actually saw Geronimo in the flesh and took pictures of Geronimo and other fellow Apache warriors back in the time, around the time where they were getting ready to surrender, but still in the heat of the moment. So a lot of the famous photos you might recognize from Geronimo were taken by this very person here. So isn't that amazing? This guy may have had a window into the actual shootout at the OK Corral and saw the real thing go down potentially. Certainly was there though to hear the ruckus, I'm sure. And then met Geronimo, has all these famous photos. Once you start looking through his work, some of them you'll recognize. Like he took the famous picture of Ike Clanton, for example. So he would have had a personal encounter with Ike Clanton. So things like that. It's just, back in the day, I think they charged 30 cents, which I don't know what that was in that day's money, but I bet it wasn't cheap to get their professional portraits taken. And he was very meticulous, it was said, even making the Apache, when they were getting their famous photos taken, readjusting their pose. And apparently he was well liked too. It sounds like the Apache respected him and got along with him just fine. So to me, he's one of the more fascinating characters in the Tombstone story. But a lot of the things that you hear about him are tied to actual photographic evidence and fact, which makes it even more fascinating. Now most people just come to Tombstone and you're gonna just go down to the main drag. You're gonna go see the shootout recreations, kind of tour the property back where the shooting happened. Now when you go, I want you to think about what I told you when you tour that replica studio and you actually see some of the work, assuming it's in the same state that it was back in the day. But definitely tip your hat, you know, to Mr. Camillus S. Fly, a Tombstone legend. And I came here to pay my respects, Mr. Fly. It's really cool. Like every time I come to this town, you know, I read, do a little bit of research, build off of my knowledge of the last few times, learn how to interpret things a little bit better, I hope, is my job. But in doing so, I kind of get to relive the history, the stories, and I build a deeper and deeper respect every single time I dive deep. And he's one of my favorite characters from the Tombstone story, the real Tombstone story. Now there's something over here on this side that I had to come and see, and it'll make more sense. Some of you already know. I know the things down on this end. My wife told me, yeah, don't park where you normally do, or else you're gonna have to walk. But I love a good cemetery. I feel at peace in these kinds of places. And we came from way over there, but it's not that big of a cemetery, so I figured I needed a little bit of exercise here, even though it's hot out here. All right, so you see that metal fence straight ahead? That's what I came here for. It was really easy to find, but what I want to demonstrate to you is, see this turn in right here? If all you want to do is come see this, and you don't care about CS Fly, which I would once again highly encourage you to give him some thought, and the other folks in there, you can obviously park right up here and probably pull up right next to it if you want and save yourself the walk, which you'd be forgiven in this June heat. So here it is, my friends. Check this out. Wow. So they need to clean up some of these weeds in there. I'd do it, or else I didn't bring my gloves. There's some thorny things on there maybe, but that ain't right. Let's get on that, somebody. I'll do it for free if I bring my gloves and I don't get in trouble for reaching in there. That's my other fear. The gentleman in the bottom there, in the photo, needs no introduction. That's Doc Holliday as portrayed by Val Kilmer. So let's unpack this and see what we're looking at. But this is a beautiful memorial. I love the plaque. So first of all, before we get to the plaque, I think part of the official monument is that little statue on top, which I assume is him playing Doc Holliday. And it's a wonderful little statue. Yeah, you can see people have laid a lot of bullets in his honor, and maybe in honor of his character. But it's a nice memorial. So I think it's worth explaining. Mr. Kilmer is not buried here. There's really nobody buried here. However, a memorial was put here, and there's a cool story behind it that I'm going to tell you that I think is really neat. But want to be clear. I want to say he was cremated, if I'm not mistaken. I think his family is in possession of his remains, is what I remember reading. So not here. So, but there's a reason why this specific plot. There's definitely a deterministic set of events that led to this. Now, if you read the plaque, I love how it starts: in honor of our Huckleberry, Val Edward Kilmer, 1959 to 2025, but I'll just summarize it. Basically, during the filming of the movie, I think Kurt Russell and Val Kilmer got along very well, is what I've heard. And Kurt Russell bought him as a gift this plot here that we're standing in front of. And in return, Val Kilmer bought Kurt Russell a plot of land that overlooks our next location, the Boothill Graveyard. So it's kind of weird how everything's tied together here today. And it mentions that he's not interred here at the cemetery, but there's a final quote at the end: "I'm your Huckleberry, Doc Holliday, Val Kilmer, Tombstone."
Don't any of you have the guts to play for blood?
I'm your huckleberry.
But I can tell you, Val Kilmer is one of my favorite actors. You know, I'm a Gen Xer, so I grew up with his work. You know, I remember movies like Willow. I think that his character was Mad Mardigan, if I remember correctly. But I love that stuff as a kid, so I'm coming at it from that angle. But of course, like many others, I do personally think his best performance of all time was as Doc Holliday in Tombstone. I mean, that freaking movie, you know, and it's it's something else. Almost everybody's seen it. And I'd say a large part of that is due to Val Kilmer and all of the one-liners that he has as Doc Holliday.
I have 2 guns, 1 for each of you.
You know, Ed, if I thought you weren't my friend, I just don't think I could bear it.
I mean, it's hilarious, it's awesome and badass. It's like, I don't know, like I've never seen anybody nail a character like that in an Old West movie quite like that. Like, he perfected that southern accent of the real Doc Holliday, who was from the South. And although I think there's lots of embellishment in the movie, there's a lot of things that I think historically cannot be substantiated, or just embellishments to make the movie good. I'm cool with that. It's a movie. It needs to be entertaining, and boy is it. I remember, like, in my early college career, like a roommate and I would, I don't know how many times we watched this movie, probably, drinking beer and being college-age males, and watched it. We knew every line, and I still do. It's probably really annoying to watch the movie, but I'm gonna guess just about everybody else has memorized probably most of the things that Doc Holliday says in the movie, because they're just so memorable and funny. And I think all that credit has to go to Val Kilmer. I mean, to me, and everybody else in the movie is fantastic too. Everybody's performance, I thought, was top notch. So I'm not trying to take away anything from the other actors in the movie. It just wouldn't have fallen together if everybody didn't give the performances they did. But yeah, I mean, that whole thing, I'm your huckleberry. It never gets old either, does it? It never gets old for me. And I say this not as an exaggeration at all. I think that if I think this through, I couldn't tell you an exact number, but I could confidently say it's a fact about my life. I bet you I've seen that movie more than any other movie ever. Probably A Christmas Story, because it's on TV all day long, like, during Christmas or Christmas Eve. That might be number 2, and it might be close, but yeah, for sure. It's just one of those things like Christmas Story. It's like you see it every year, it's on TV, and then you get sucked into it, even though you've seen it and you know every single line. That's what this was like. Like that's the magic, I think. And I have to give that, to me personally, that connection to that character Doc Holliday is really what hooked me and brought me in. And then I gave closer examination to everything, and it's, so now, and I say, isn't that a daisy all the time on this show? And I'm thinking of that. That's what it's a reference to. But yeah, like Val Kilmer, I don't know him personally. I know there is some critique about him and how he behaved in movies, and he addresses that, I think, in his biography that he made before he passed. I think his son narrated his voice for him. Another good one you should check out if you like Val Kilmer. But I've probably seen every single thing he's done, even like the late stuff that's more obscure in his later career, I'm familiar with. So just one of those actors that maybe it's just timing, because I'm a Gen Xer and grew up with it and got to see the evolution of him watching movies like The Doors. Like, I used to love that movie when I was in high school, because that came out in the early 90s, I think, if I remember. Probably at the, not too far off from when he probably made this movie, probably around the same relative time. And I think that was a golden age of Kilmer, all these characters that he did. He was so good at imitating and learning how people talked and getting the sound and dialect right. And it all culminated with that role. So yes, one of the greats of our time, Val Edward Kilmer. So I should say thank you, Kurt Russell, for doing that, or thinking to have the thought to do that, because unfortunately now that Val has passed, that's a very sad thing, that then a loss to the world. But you know, it's that whole thing is so tied and embroiled in the current Tombstone tourism industry even. It's just, you see iconography, it's just such a cult classic thing that the fact that, you know, presumably if that was purchased back in the 1990s, maybe they didn't have the vision that the film was going to become what it did. I've heard others talk about it, and you know, it didn't do well at the box office when it came out. So I think a lot of that cult status that it has is from just over the years, because it was that good. So the fact that he bought that, maybe it wouldn't have had as much meaning today if the film and that character didn't end up being what it did. So kudos to Kurt Russell for that. That's really cool. All right, you saw our second stop here on our cemetery tour here in Tombstone. We saw Ed Schieffelin's monument and grave. We now saw Tombstone Cemetery, and I showed you two famous residents. There are some other historically significant people in here, including the gentleman that donated the land for this cemetery back in the day, Escapule. Forgive me on the pronunciation. I believe it's the gentleman whose portrait, and he was a well-known person, but interestingly, speaking of Doc Holliday, his portrait is one that is pinned as a Doc Holliday photo, and it clearly isn't Doc Holliday. If you've studied, you know, the one photo of known Providence of him being younger, and then look at this other one, the other guy has Mexican descent, but I don't know if that's the same exact Escapule that I'm thinking of. It probably is, but just thought I'd mention that. And we made it here again. I must have visited here, I don't know, in my entire lifetime. Maybe 4 or 5 times. This might be number 5. But we will, of course, check out some of the popular ones that most of you expect to see. But I did come here with one purpose in mind, though, where I'm gonna try to debunk something today. So one thing that's good to know about this, just to kind of lay down some framework, I'm not sure if the current pamphlet says it or not, but in the past they have. But most of these markers you see today with all the rocks piles here, and certainly the epitaphs and tombstones, the tombstones have all been recreated, because the originals would have been just wood and completely lost to time. There's even stories of owners of this property at certain times putting up like metal markers, and once lightning struck one, I think they thought that was a bad idea. But maybe more importantly is that the rock piles themselves, something concedes that these piles could be like a few inches or a couple feet, you know, to the left or right of the proper location. So this isn't perfection that you're seeing. So that kind of pulls into something I'm gonna get at in a little bit. And here's the perfect opportunity to see what I'm saying. It's one of these things is not like the other, is the game we're playing. Anybody see what I'm talking about? Well, it should be pretty obvious. You got this tombstone here with a really long epitaph. It's twice the height of any other ones around here, and it's pretty colorful and playful. It says, "Here lies Lester Moore, 4 slugs from a 44, no less, no more." Quite arguably, maybe one of the most famous epitaphs in this place, and it's been reused in theme parks around the country. So something that kind of, to me, makes it fun. But is it real? So I couldn't tell you definitively if it's real or not, but what I can tell you is I've never seen anything of provenance to back that up. You'll have people claim very quickly that it's 100% authentic. So, you know, it just stands out, as I'm gonna just shelf it at that. So I've been skeptical, as have others. I think the Tombstone Chamber of Commerce website either says or used to say, something used to publicly say that they question the authenticity, I'll put it that way, of a lot of these headstones in here. And thinking of how this place was pretty much abandoned at one point, left to just have the land overtake it, you know, markers deteriorating, you gotta wonder like how they actually figured out who was who. And if they had records and all of these things were derived from actual records, now we got something, right? Now we got something. But, you know, there's a lot of questionable stuff. And when it became a tourism stop, I mean, you know, that fun stuff sells, right? You got to have something memorable. And it's genius. Whoever did that is genius. And if it's the original epitaph, it's even more genius. But, you know, it's just something to think about, I guess. Something to be cautious about when you're studying Old West history. And I can tell you, too, that, you know, I've got a gate going to my backyard, and it's got wooden slats. And when the original boards were put in, I presume in the 1990s, probably by the late, you know, around 2008, 2009, the wood was completely rotted away and almost gone. And that was from the 1990s, right? So my point is, finding any kind of wooden monuments left over that are originals in cemeteries is exceedingly rare. So, you know, over the years, I think these things, like I said, have been replaced not just once, probably many times. And a lot of these white ones, even, I don't remember. I see more like newer looking ones. So maybe they're slowly getting rid of the wood and getting something more permanent now. Maybe it's plastic now, I don't know. I don't recall seeing those before. Or maybe it is wood that's just painted over and they just kind of repainted on them. But even that, I do detect differences from visit to visit in my short time here. So here is a known murder that actually I would say is true. So that's why this cemetery is fascinating to me, is that you do have verifiable things like this. The Marshal Fred White was shot by Curly Bill in 1880. They marked the location of the shooting in Tombstone, right in front of where the Birdcage Theater is currently. But so, you know, this place definitely has things of historic interest, I would say. Assuming we know how to map him to this spot, or how that was done over time. You know, I'm gonna just go ahead and play along on some of these things for now and assume, like, somebody with a bigger name like this, the actual location is known for sure. But I did find one thing finally in my academic studies of somebody, a character who's not buried here, but who did shoot somebody. And I'm keeping an eye out for that because I do believe I found a verifiable inaccuracy, or maybe even better put, that somebody being kind of creative with how they're portraying information, which creates some implicit meaning. So once again, note the short nature of most of these monuments, and then the height of this one, the height because it's got a very colorful, once again, epitaph, hanged by mistake. He was right, we was wrong, but we strung him up and now he's gone. Love it. To me, it's poetry and it makes this place fun, but it's another one of those where maybe it's less of a question if George Johnson was hanged and hanged by mistake, and more of like the epitaph that you see. Because I don't know, back then, I would like to see more of what they looked like and how much they cost to make, and imprinting that much text into a wooden monument, I think that's probably why they didn't do it. And you don't see stuff like that. It's probably a name and a date, which makes me question even more. So I've been on a very leisurely quest in life to study the Old West, like an armchair historian, but one that tries to do it academically. I read the boring biographies, the things that are just a long, never-ending list of this one begot that one, and that one begot this one in this year, and here's the the citation that backs everything up, citation after citation, right? So that's the kind of history that I like, which isn't for everybody. And what you start to find slow by slow when you dig deep is so many things you hear about are highly questionable, not based in any actual physical evidence, like a newspaper clipping, an epitaph, for example, or not an epitaph, a obituary, or something along that where you can trace it back to a known source. But these fellas have been portrayed in history and in the movies time and time again, but this really did happen. The murder of Billy Clanton, Frank McClowery, Tom McClowery, and Billy Clanton, murdered on the streets of Tombstone in 1881 by, of course, the Earp brothers and Doc Holliday, which we know happened. That is fact, backed up by court case evidence. Everything is there, so there's no question that this one didn't happen. And you know how I like to tie things together. C.S. Fly, one of his most famous photos is the photo of these guys in their coffins, like with the glass or the open fronts where you see their faces. More evidence of the murder, right? And I want to say it was Billy Clanton. It was the only photograph he's ever had was in that coffin. So another interesting fact. But you do have row upon row, column upon column of graves here. And the thing they say about Boot Hill and where it got its name is that most of these are men that died with their boots on, meaning they died, you know, probably in a violent way, a shooting or something, right? And this was known to be a cemetery for the not so nice people, which is probably why it's all dudes. Mostly. There are some females here too. This here is an interesting one. This is Billy Claiborne, which I think you'd see his portrayal in the movie we talked about earlier. And he was shot by this guy named Buckskin Frank Leslie in 1882. That is a verifiable known one. And in fact, we were at the Yuma Territorial Prison recently, and Leslie was there. And here's the grave of interest that I came to see what its current state is today. All it says is Hancock, 1879, shot. And I want to say there was a previous iteration, I could have this wrong, that also said shot by Ringo. But the pamphlet certainly says shot by Ringo, referring to Johnny Ringo from you would know that character from the Tombstone movies, but no, he was a real person. Although I'm doing some deeper research on him and reading books, and probably not as colorful as the movies portray, but definitely some said he had a temper, and I believe I saw a newspaper article that does talk about this very shooting. The problem is, in my research thus far, Hancock did not die from that gunshot. So, and then here's the other problem. In the brochure here, it says he was shot by Ringo because of an argument over a woman. And then I want to say the article I read said there was a quote about Hancock, maybe they were drinking really drunk, and Ringo offered him a whiskey is what I read, and he preferred beer, and then Ringo shot him as a result. So you've got multiple portrayals of the shooting, but the shooting did happen. But unlike the movies, my research so far shows that Johnny Ringo didn't kill a single person in his entire time in Arizona. Well, how was that, you say? Well, the movies don't always get it right. And this would back that up. Didn't mean he didn't shoot a guy, but that guy didn't die from that. So that begs the question, what is the meaning of the epitaph? Yes, you could say on its own, it stands that he was shot, but putting it on an epitaph brings implicit meaning that we derive. We assume his death was by a shot, and we assume he was shot by Johnny Ringo, meaning Johnny Ringo murdered him, and that certainly is not the case from the research I'm doing. So right there, we have something strange. And if I am correct that it used to say shot by Ringo back in the past, I don't know where I remembered this somehow, it's just off of my memory. So that's probably why, or maybe it was in the brochure that I got it. Doesn't really matter. The problem that I have is the way it's presented would lead one to believe that Johnny Ringo shot this guy Hancock, and now we have two different stories around the reason why it was done, which is one of them cannot be correct. And but yeah, it's that, I guess I would say it's either someone misunderstood that, or they were trying to hide some implicit meaning to add to the drama factor of this graveyard, meaning, hey, there's a guy that Johnny Ringo shot and killed laying here, but not really. Johnny Ringo did shoot a guy named Hancock in 1879, but he did not die from that incident. And maybe if it was on the epitaph, they swapped it out because maybe there were other historians or people like me that are annoying that were pointing that out, and they simplified it. And you could be crafty, right? So you can't really call that a false statement. But the real question would be, what did Hancock die of? Did he die of a different gunshot wound from somebody else? Did he die of tuberculosis 4 years later? Is the date we see on there the date of his death, or is it referring to the shot? And, did he die of other causes in 1879? All of these questions that are as of yet unanswered, and I have barely scratched the surface, so I've not gone that deep yet. I don't know if I even know if you can go that deep. That'd be really difficult probably, but anyway, I just thought this was an interesting thing to show you and kind of talk through. There is one other in here that I suppose brings like an implicit meaning to the headstone where we should qualify it correctly. And it's kind of in the same vein of what I just said. I'm trying to go by memory. If this is it, then I'm good. I'm real good. Because I'm starting to memorize the locations of a lot of these markers. I did really well today. Most of them I could find. I knew it. Like I just, I did a whole video on this guy and his merry band of bandits, something called the Bisbee Massacre. And this guy, I think it was due to a territorial law. Basically, he got a murder charge, and but I don't think he was going to be hanged, if I remember correctly, and the townsfolk were really upset, so they lynched him. There's actually a photo of the lynching and him being hanged on a telegraph pole, the remnants of which you can still see today. Another cool piece of that embedded history that I'm kind of referring to. But my understanding is he was not actually buried here, and I want to say he was taken back to Texas and interred in Texas. So if I'm remembering that correctly, and I think others have agreed with me, I would expect there to either not be a body under here in this approximate location, or somebody other than John Heath is buried here and they botched the headstone. Or the third possibility, because it's been so long and I forget what evidence I had to back it up, or he really wasn't interred in Texas and moved to Texas. But it's another one of those things where my recollection is it seemed like a legit claim. So that's the kind of thing. It's like, this sign makes you implicitly think that John Heath, who was lynched by a mob, all true, is buried here and died. Well, he did die in Tombstone, but buried here. If there's no other interpretation to be offered, that would be the assumption I think most would make. But so far, it really, you could see some of these might be minor infractions. They could be forgiven potentially. If I'm even right, I could be wrong. And if I ever do say something that's verifiably incorrect, I want to be corrected. I say this all the time, but it must be accompanied by a citation, a reference to a credible source for me to consider it. So if you're in the business of wanting to change minds, that's the qualification you have to go through with me. I'm kind of a tough cookie that way, but anyway. Now these fellas, Tex, Bill, and Dan, are the other participants in the Bisbee Massacre, and the ones that actually, I think, did the actual violence. And they were, of course, hanged here. You can go to the Tombstone County Courthouse, and they have a replica gallows that's supposed to, I think, be a replica for this big event where I want to say, if I remember correctly, they sold tickets to it, and the crowd went wild, we'll say. But these were some really bad dudes. Like if the history is the way it's told is correct, and I believe it because there's a lot of court cases around it and all that, These guys were just some really dumb robbers who had no problem pulling the trigger and just getting violent. You combine those two things and that's not a good formula. But there you have it, really. I wanted to do 3 quick stops and think of something interesting to say at each. I got to see Val Kilmer's cenotaph finally, and got to go validate the Ringo grave to see the current state of it. So when you combine that, like I said, with the brochure, they do quote the Ringo shot him, so it carries the implicitness forward. But really glad I got to do this today.